Hello again. I am Len Riedel, and awkward as it is, I'm going to be introducing myself for the presentation that I'm about to give on Grant's Overland Campaign in May of 1995. One of the pleasures I've had in the early going at Blue and Gray, so many times when I would stand up in front of the audiences, I would welcome them to my Walter Mitty dream. I mean, I had gone back for some period of time, had had a long fascination with the Civil War that had been further burnished by my time as a cadet at VMI from 1971 to 1975. And then I had begun to collect my books. The first set of books that I got was a reprint by Arno Press, The Rebellion Record, which was contemporary printings from the newspapers and elsewhere that were being printed during the Civil War, and they were compiled. And then I began to add other things, as you'll find out over a series of lectures when I tell other stories related to that. But the reason I said that is that while I may be the executive director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, I'm first and foremost a historian. I have a master's degree in history from Old Dominion University with an emphasis in policy and strategy. And my specific area of interest is in military political relations and how they interface with each other, which makes me a big, I find Clausewitz and Jean Monnet and things like that fairly interesting from the political element. And I subscribe to the most basic Clausewitzian tenet, which is that war is politics at its most extreme, and that war basically is a result of the failure of diplomacy, which is well articulated by Hans Morgenthau in his book Politics Among Nations, which is in about its 25th printing, and Henry Kissinger's fine book post government service called Diplomacy. Both of those, I think, articulate well the relationship and the role that the military has in this. And so when I allow myself the luxury of engaging in making presentations, and in addition to running the program, every once in a while I do, and you will see throughout this that I've given lectures on things that fascinate me or interest me. And a few of those I've actually led some tours, probably 20 tours or so over the course of time, just because I enjoy it. I'd rather do that than administrative work. So with Grant, and the reason I opted to do this lecture was that Grant represented a major shift in national policy at that time. Abraham Lincoln had been frustrated in his efforts to find general or a combination of military leadership that would move precipitously towards bringing the war to a conclusion. You have to keep in mind that there hadn't been a president of the United States who had followed himself after 4 years since Andrew Jackson. That had been 28 years since a president had had a second term. And I think certainly that box of time for achievements certainly governs a lot of times how a elected official constructs their national policy. And in Lincoln's case, he walks right into the midst of a brewing, pending war because his predecessor does not do anything to stop that. For several years, Lincoln finds frustration in trying to put together coalition leadership in which he hires Democrats like George McClellan and or George Gordon Meade to lead his armies. And in each instance, he finds that they just don't have quite enough. The first successful Eastern general he finds is Gordon Meade, who takes over just before Gettysburg and defeats Robert E. Lee, the first time that Lee has been unquestionably defeated since he has taken command of the Army of Northern Virginia. But then Lincoln finds himself frustrated by Meade's relative inaction for the remainder of 1863, culminating with the miserable efforts at Mine Run in the fall of 1863. So, with the election year coming up in '64, Lincoln is fairly frustrated, and he's looking for somebody. And lo and behold, who has delivered success after success after success, but U.S. Grant. And so, selecting this particular theme and looking at Grant and his execution of military operations, I like to say Grant understood the calculus of war. He understood that ultimately, if you had more men than the other guy and you killed people one for one, you would win at the end. And while that was not something that Grant necessarily relished, he understood that you couldn't walk away from an engagement before you had gotten everything out of it that you could get out of it. And that was Grant's challenge. So I found that this would be a great topic, given that this was the first great matchup of Lee versus Grant. This is before Chris Calkins and had concocted and come up with the Virginia Civil War Trails program or any of this other stuff. And Grant versus Lee was the titanic struggle. It would ultimately be the culminating struggle, and it would not end until Grant hosted Robert E. Lee in Wilmer McLean's parlor in Appomattox some 13 months later. So it is a fascination, and I think that you will find as you look at a much younger and not so wizened and white speaker that I was really animated by the subject, and I hope you'll enjoy my presentation on Grant, Butcher or Hero. Thanks very much, and enjoy.
We can no longer deny his place in the pantheon of military heroes. This campaign is a capstone of a meteoric rise from displaced Mexican war captain to colonel of volunteers, through brigadier general and major general, to a rank equal to the founder of the country himself, George Washington, that of lieutenant general and commander of all the armies of the United States. Hiram Ulysses Grant, as you may know, became U.S. Grant as a result of an administrative error in his application paperwork for the West Point class of 1842. Despite efforts to correct it, the appellation stuck and was later conveniently carved into a legend which gave the United States its first real national hero in February of 1862. Grant was not an outstanding student. I would not suppose to present that to you. But he was a critical thinker, and he committed some revolutionary principles into his personal mantra. The most radical of them came from the teachings of West Point professor Dennis Hart Mahan. Mahan had evaluated the writings of Napoleonic chronicler Henri Jomini and extrapolated the principle that war was progressive and that new technologies would generate new tactics. This in turn would change the nature of war into life and death struggles for the survival of the nation. In turn, this suggested that war must be prosecuted against the entire capabilities of the enemy. This radical concept demanded that governments very carefully select future wars which had very clear moral purposes. Remember, this is being taught in 1840. Mahan's influence in the development of critical thinking in the classes of West Point was profound, for although Grant and his 51 colleagues in the class of 1842 were not yet in positions of leadership, they were wrestling with the constructs that Mahan presented to them. Grant wrestled with that and concluded and wrote in his memoirs that he had determined that the Mexican War was wrong because it was immoral. Grant's specific complaint with the Mexican War was that it was being fought merely to satisfy an imperialistic ambition. That was to assimilate another slave state for the purposes of political balance. Although Grant objected to the war, he contributed in a small way, received a brevet, and left as a captain, and then, of course, eventually left the Army. This is a critical point to understand about the training at West Point, or for that matter, any military academy, in that it reveals a dimension of the professional soldier's psychology which helps us to define the components of his leadership, what makes him effective. The issue of moral leadership is as important in war as it is in peace. The fact that Grant accepted the totality of war is a logical extension of advancing technology is difficult for me to explain in a short period of time. That in and of itself is the subject of another talk. However, I will make a short effort to overview what I think that concept means. The great wars that were in the recent memory of the cadets at West Point were the Napoleonic Wars. These great revolutionary experiences had seen the advent of armies of levy. No longer were there professional armies necessarily, but there were armies of the masses. The common draft of citizens into a large in the 19th century, this would have been it. Certainly not the Civil War. Grant's classmates in 1842 included men such as James Longstreet, Simon Bolivar Buckner, George McClellan, and William Tecumseh Sherman. Think about those names. Think about what you know of their performance in the Civil War in view of what I've said about Mahan. The manner in which these future general officers prosecuted war is diverse as the individuals. Influenced by Napoleonic tactics, some retained the romanticism of war, while others, most notably Longstreet and Sherman, perceived the upcoming changes which mass armies, technology, and tactics would present. The contributions they would make in influencing the movements and destinies of the forces they would command are well known. Suffice it to say that the leadership program as developed at West Point for the Brotherhood of Arms would have profound manifestations in the mature laboratory of the American Civil War. Faced with internal conflict and the monotony of a soldier's existence in the peacetime U.S. Army and a noticeable problem with John Barleycorn, Grant took the same path as a number of other West Point classmates who had remained loyal to the Union but had found promotion and advancement in the Union Army slow. He left the service to get married to Julia and to take a step at financial independence. Of course, we know he was unsuccessful at everything he tried as a civilian, but he kept after it until the irrepressible conflict forced him to step up to the line and offer his services to the government. The wording of this offer is informative about the man. Quote, feeling it the duty of everyone who has been educated at government expense to offer their services for the support of that government, I have the honor, very respectfully, to tender my services until the close of the war in such capacity as may be offered. Close quotes. What we learn from this short request to return to active duty is the clear sense of duty that Grant felt in this time of crisis. He didn't seek high office, although his West Point pedigree certainly earned him this rebellion. They would have been court-martialed and cashiered, very similar to Fort Fitz-John Porter. Given congressional and national outcry over the debacle at Ball's Bluff just 6 months prior, both officers would have most likely ended up in front of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Clearly, Grant had not managed to sweep the field the next day, the event would have compelled a retreat under the harassing guns of an impromptu siege and an ignominious defeat over what is. As it was, Shiloh was claimed as a Union victory, Grant's fort. Certainly sensing Grant's momentum, Halleck quickly repaired field command, dropping Grant to secondary importance for the time being and commenced a ponderous and unimaginative siege to Corinth. That successful event, combined with other departmental successes such as those enjoyed by John Pope, give Halleck the logical right to claim McClellan's recently vacated general-in-chiefship. Inasmuch as Halleck was a published theoretician, Lincoln brought him to Washington and Grant was elevated to departmental command. This new opportunity placed Grant in line to direct the opening of the Mississippi River. This strategic, painstakingly successful military operation challenged Grant to use all of his resources, and having been removed from the constraints of subordination to Halleck, he did just that. This is not to suggest that he was immune to political intrigue, it was just easier to operate beyond the mountains down to the immediate prying eyes of Washington. Regardless, the war was still not going the Union's way, and some popular discontent was beginning to emerge. McClellan had failed, as had Pope. McClellan had ineptly parlayed a major intelligence coup into a stalemate at Sharpsburg and had allowed Lee's seriously wounded army to escape. Burnside had failed miserably at Fredericksburg and had been replaced by Hooker. First Buell, then Rosecrans, had won hollow victories over Braxton Bragg. These realities and Lincoln's revision of his war objectives to include emancipation of the slaves further solidified the need in Grant's mind to move aggressively forward. For nearly a year, Grant contrived and implemented various schemes to crack Pemberton's defensive works. He tried turning movements, amphibious operations, and diversionary tactics. Both naval and land forces were impressed to dislodge the Confederates from the fortress of Vicksburg. When he discovered he couldn't directly break the lines, he attempted to make the fort of Vicksburg irrelevant by cutting a canal across the DeSoto Peninsula to support a move south of the city without having to pass the batteries of Vicksburg. As Dr. Joe Glathar so brilliantly points out in his award-winning book Partners in Command, Grant understood the need to work closely with the Navy, and he clearly earned Admiral Porter's admiration and unconditional support. Grant's management of his field forces and subsequent execution of the siege are brilliant, and we can learn a great deal from him by his actions. First, he created diversion by sending General Benjamin Grierson on a diversionary raid to mask his movements down the Louisiana side of the Mississippi. In doing so, he completely bypassed the Confederate strongholds at Vicksburg and Grand Gulf and forced Pemberton to react when he crossed completely unopposed at Bruinsburg and marched at night to initiate a battle at Fort Gibson. Then he saw an opportunity to dispose of the problematic enemy force near Raymond, Mississippi on his right, and he turned in the middle of a march to clear his flank and rear. He carefully maneuvered to keep Joseph Johnston's from ever becoming a factor and then proceeded to hem Pemberton in. Grant reached Vicksburg and succumbing to a fit of ambition allowed his forces to make a poorly conceived and coordinated general assault on the impregnable Vicksburg lines. Failing that, he stitched the Confederates into their burial shroud, permitting terrorism by day and night. Consistent bombardment from the gunboats and mining operations left the population defiant but very uncertain. At the point of surrender, Grant had sappers simultaneously mining under numerous Confederate redoubts, redams, and forts. Once the city was cinched up, Grant refused to permit the non-combatants to leave. They too shared the horrors of the living entombment. It is clear at this point that Grant has formulated his policy of total war and has begun to implement it. This was not a meaningless gesture. Grant had learned to respect the nature of Southern resistance. He understood that the rebel soldiers were committed to the cause. Because of that, he knew the war must become so harsh, the rebel soldiers would question the value of continued service to a country that could not protect their families and their property. Grant does not appear to seek formal ratification of this policy. It is more of an attitude and is extremely local in application. Grant is deep within Southern country and he has the opportunity to wreak havoc, so he does. Jackson burns. The surrender of Pemberton was also an unconditional demand, modified by the reality that he didn't have the means to move 26,000 prisoners to camps in the north. Soldiers were paroled but so demoralized they ceased to maintain any integrity as a fighting entity. This second instance of the destruction of an army reflects the epitome of the military art, and the campaign received generous treatment in the West Point Civil War bloc, nearly 25% of their textbook. Soldiers from that point on have been taught that the enemy army is the center of gravity of the resistance, the object of attack, the purpose being complete and utter destruction of the enemy forces. We saw this in the defeat of the German army in World War II and in Desert Storm against the Iraqi Republican Guard. Not to be lost in this brilliant achievement at Vicksburg is Grant's actions after capitulation. Similar to Shiloh, he immediately turns in an attempt to chase, catch, and destroy Johnson's so-called relief force. Although he was not successful, he of course will do this with lethal effect after the siege of Petersburg is lifted. The national jubilation over Vicksburg earned Grant orders to lift the siege of Chattanooga, which he did, helping to avert the starvation of the garrison. The integrated nature of the operation is most impressive. By opening a reliable food line, he immediately raised the morale of the troops, of the besieged troops. The subsequent military maneuvers quickly demoralized the besiegers by pushing the Confederates off of both Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. The resulting confusion and chaotic withdrawal of Confederate forces resulted in the long overdue relief of Braxton Bragg. Winter quarters found Grant preparing for the spring campaign and advising Washington that he believed the best way to beat Lee and end the war was to land and operate against Lee's railroads in North Carolina. Interestingly about this letter, Grant made the recommendation only after being asked what strategy he might pursue and without suggesting that he would be the person to execute it. At this point, everyone in the North expected that Grant would soon become the General-in-Chief. Grant's letter on strategy proved to be extremely naive, and Halleck quickly read him in on the political necessity to move against Lee in Richmond, especially in a political year. Armed with that intelligence and a natural deference to political authorities and a very specific and twice or three times repeated inquiry from the administration, which resulted in Grant's disavowal of any intention to seek Lincoln's old job, Grant was made a lieutenant general. In Washington, the mood was grim. For nearly 3 years, the war moved back and forth across the landscape. It had long since ceased to be a gentleman's war, and Lincoln had made some hard decisions. In his first inaugural address, he had noted that if he could restore the Union by freeing all the slaves, he would do that. And if he could maintain the Union by freeing none of them, he would do that also. The war in the East had been prosecuted in such a manner which seemed to avoid offending the rebels. Lincoln endured McClellan until 1862's midterm elections passed, and then he sent him packing. When John Pope, the son of a family friend, achieved some dubious success in the West, Lincoln succumbed to the rhetoric of bombast and brought him east at the urging of the radical Republicans who believed the rebels needed to be treated with a mailed fist rather than as errant brothers. Pope failed in part due to the Easterners' clique which supported McClellan and the brilliance of Lee's and Jackson's tactics. Lincoln was also dealing with the Congressional Committee on Conduct of the War, which had been formulated to investigate military misfortunes such as Ball's Bluff. The Benways of the world had delegated this oversight responsibility to themselves and had urged Lincoln to force the issue. When Lincoln's black Republican constituency pressed him on emancipation, Lincoln's cup had clearly runneth over. One of the classic principles of military political strategy is Baron von Clausewitz, and in his famous theoretical treatise on war, which is a series of essays dealing with principles of war, Clausewitz makes a number of very specific and important points. Perhaps the most important one to keep in mind at that time and at this time as well is the talk and the assertion that war is politics in its most radical form. In other words, wars are fought for specific national objectives, and those are determined by the political leadership of the country. In recent terms, the Gulf War was fought by the Allied coalition to eject Iraq from Kuwait and to restore the Emir from stabilizing the region. Thus stabilizing the region. Once these objectives were achieved, the political leadership of the coalition made a calculated, and some critics still maintain a wrong decision, to stop the war. The reason was a hope that the Iraqis could be reconstructed to join the brotherhood of civilized nations. President Bush understood the issue of Arab versus Arab and had been sensitive, and he believed by not humiliating the Iraqis, he would gain more in the long run. What was the political result? Well, Iraq is still not reconstructed. However, a number of previously intransigent Arab nations have signed peace treaties or agreements with Israel, thus contributing to the stability of the region. This is what Clausewitz meant by the prosecution of war as political ends. Now, why did I take you through that? Well, to understand Grant, this campaign, and Grant's legacy, you must understand what were his imperatives. Lincoln tried to give the war moral dimensions. Faced with the disintegration of federal authority in the Deep South, even before he took office, he tried to appease the secessionists by promising to leave slavery alone and by shifting the responsibility for armed conflict from his shoulders to that of the rebels. In his inaugural, he had spoken directly to his moral and constitutional authority by telling the country he had the most solemn duty to preserve the Union. Having failed that, he maneuvered Jefferson Davis into authorizing an attack on the American flag at Fort Sumter. That politically savvy and storied assault backfired, and Lincoln subsequently called for 75,000 volunteers to support suppress combinations against the government which were too strong for civil authority. And he succeeded then in forcing a number of the border states out of the Union. The rebels' defiant establishment of Richmond as their capital defined the future battleground, and contrary to Richard's point this morning, the strategic imperatives of the theater. With Richmond just 100 miles away, the entire nation clamored for a move on Richmond. Lincoln's first commander, Irvin McDowell, resisted Lincoln's demands to move, protesting his troops were too green and inexperienced. Lincoln responded that the rebel troops were green also and that the country could not tolerate inaction, especially knowing that the original 90-day volunteers were soon set to leave the service. I won't take you through each of them in the East. However, it's important to understand that what had caused failure in the East, these issues were non-negotiable. First, Washington, D.C. would be held as a seat of government. It would not and could not be abandoned. Therefore, the Army of the Potomac was really the home guard of the nation's capital. Second, the symbol of rebel defiance was being flaunted directly in front of the federal capitol. Jeff Davis was in business in a very visible location. Third, the war was being financed by the Congress which sat in session in Washington, D.C. Inaction was obvious and it was intolerable for people whose constituents were filling the armies. Fourth, Washington was the confluence of national and international politics. Information traveled quickly and summary judgment was a real issue to deal with. Lincoln wanted a general who would end the war as quickly as possible on as favorable terms as he could be offered. These were still Americans in the South, and they had to be reconciled once the Union was restored. And Lincoln was irrevocably committed to ensuring that it would be restored. Previous generals had failed because they didn't understand the national objectives, and they left Lincoln dangling. McClellan was a Democrat and the darling of the anti-Lincoln faction, who had the temerity to suggest political solutions to Lincoln. He might have been tolerated if he was an aggressive and militarily successful general. However, he wasn't. Not only that, but he was part of the old school of military thought that civilian leadership ought to stay with things civilian. McClellan's opinion of his commander-in-chief consisted of referring to him as an imbecile and calling him the original guerrilla. McClellan failed to keep Lincoln informed, accused him of undermining his authority, and refused to be responsive to Lincoln's peremptory orders, such as the remarkable series of general war orders, which Lincoln issued in frustration just before the Peninsula Campaign unfolded. Even worse, McClellan risked the security of the capital after Lincoln's specific orders to the contrary. For Lincoln, the last straw was McClellan's failure to aggressively pursue and destroy a dramatically weakened rebel force after Sharpsburg. The fate of McClellan was not lost on other Union commanders. Buell lost his job after the Kentucky Campaign of 1862, nominally a victory. Rosecrans lost his after he had won the Tullahoma Campaign and then allowed himself to be embarrassed, beaten at Chickamauga, and pinned up at Chattanooga. Burnside immediately pushed to the offensive, stole the march on Lee, only to lose his nerve at the critical moment, not permitting the crossing of the Rappahannock until adequate pontoons and unfortunately Lee's army arrived. After the disaster of Marie's Heights, just 3 miles from the site, he commenced a flanking maneuver around Lee, only to be betrayed by the elements in and around Falmouth. Hooker also understood the need for speed, and he successfully flanked Lee, only to lose the initiative by a misplaced belief that Lee would have to attack him. Unfortunately, Hooker left his flank in the air, and he suffered the thrashing which Lee and Jackson administered near this site. Hooker's quibbling over the disposition of troops nominally under his control while Lee was loose in Maryland and Pennsylvania cost him his command and produced an opportunity for George Gordon Meade. Meade's remarkable response under the most difficult circumstances possible, the cataclysm of Gettysburg, quickly lost its credibility when he failed to pursue Lee and allowed him to return to Virginia. Lincoln's frustration was public, it was measurable, and nearly resulted in Meade's relief. When Meade's inactivity permitted Lee to detach Longstreet to Georgia, not only was the Federal Army in the East humiliated, but the theater of action was permitted to slip away from the proximity of Washington. Finally, Meade's half-heartedly finished 1863 with the mine run fiasco. At this point, Lincoln was clearly near the end of his tether. Now let's bring Grant back into focus on the national scene. Here is a man who had won at Belmont, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg. He had liberated Tennessee, including Lincoln's personal interest area in eastern Tennessee. And he reopened the Mississippi River, redeeming Lincoln's prediction that Vicksburg was the key and the war couldn't be won until the key was in the Union pocket. After the Chickamauga disaster, Grant rode in on his white Charger, reopened the food line, and smashed Bragg's siege into a disorderly retreat. Then he sent Sherman to help Burnside chase Longstreet away from Knoxville. How could Lincoln not turn to him? Lincoln and Grant were neither personally acquainted nor even official correspondents. Grant did not write correspondence out of channel, but he didn't have to. He had a political sponsor, Senator L.I.U. Washburn. I don't think Washburn had to intrigue in a normal sense to gain favor for Grant. Grant's accomplishments spoke for themselves. As for Lincoln, he was now facing election. The war was not going well. There had been draft riots. The emancipation policy was controversial. Lincoln's strategy was still clearly restoration of the Union. However, it was influenced by the needs of the coalition Lincoln needed to sustain if he was to govern. Lincoln had to pay attention to the radical Republicans and the abolitionists, or he risked not even being renominated by his party. These groups insisted on harsh treatment of the rebels and unconditional emancipation for the slaves. If Lincoln didn't end the war soon, he would have circumstances driving his policies. Grant's previous successes gave him the same moral force which McClellan had received. The administration undoubtedly looked Grant over in his politics and determined he was the man to take charge of the war. Grant didn't seek supreme command or the rank of lieutenant general, and if he was impressed by the trapping, he would have dressed a little better and taken the opportunity to promote a personal agenda. Instead, he told his friend Sherman that he had been summoned to Washington to meet the president, but he would turn the job down if he were required to ride to desk to replace his headquarters in Washington. We know Grant didn't spend much time in Washington politicking. His headquarters was in Culpeper with Meade. Here he formulated a plan which precisely met the president's objectives. He would move all the military forces of the United States simultaneously against the residual Confederate armies to exhaust him and prevent him from reinforcing each other on internal lines of communication. He entrusted the Western Department and its armies of Cumberland and Ohio to his protégés Sherman and McPherson. There he put Johnson back upon Atlanta. He wanted the political general, former Speaker of the House Nathaniel Banks, to move against Mobile, a major port on the Gulf of Mexico. And German politico Franz Sigel was to move up the Shenandoah Valley, while Benjamin proceeded. However, Lee was another issue. With him rested the future of the administration's war policy. Grant would bivouac here. You have heard and will hear about the battles of this campaign, so I won't repeat them here, except to make comment about how Grant responded in certain critical leadership roles. To start, Grant was in command. He issued orders through Meade. However, the two command tents were never far apart. He said that he did this for a few reasons. First, he found Meade to be a good, competent officer. After all, he had beaten Lee at Gettysburg. Second, Grant was still the commanding general of all the armies of the United States. Without a competent army commander, he might have been bogged down in the minutiae of the Army of the Potomac's operations. There were and would be times later in which Grant was away from the Army or was dealing with the multitudes of politicians which surrounded the Army. However, most importantly, I think the unwritten reason Grant left the Army of the Potomac's command structure intact was his extreme sensitivity to the negative auras surrounding the Army. He wanted them to have successes. I based this on his specific decision to hold Sherman and his army out of Virginia when the death bell of Lee's army was rung. In addition, the fact that the two armies were given separate grand reviews in Washington a day apart indicates that there were very specific identities which Grant wished to provide to the country. Grant's decision to move through the wilderness was not a defiance of Lee, nor was it a foolish maneuver. He needed to get at Lee, and he wanted him in an open field. The closer he could get to Richmond, the better would be his chances to achieve that. Never before had Lee been forced to fight continuously on fields not of his own choosing. Grant was forced that. Grant was caught in the wilderness, the route which he had to follow to be south of the Rappahannock and the Rapidan. Had he maneuvered west of those rivers, he would have moved away from Richmond and would have left himself dependent on a supply line which ran through Mosby's Confederacy. A move to the east through Fredericksburg would risk a repeat of Burnside's blunder and an argument to move the army via the peninsula would overlap Butler while seeming to avoid combat with Lee. Grant had to go the way he did and risk the combat he was likely to find. Grant's implacable demeanor during the action, frequently whittling away the hours while chain-smoking cigars, belittles a period of high stress and anxiety. Once the Wilderness Front had stabilized, both Grant and Lee logically concluded the next move had to be Spotsylvania. For Grant, any other move would earn him the same disdain his predecessors had garnered. The famous line, quote, "I propose to fight it out on this line of the Capes all summer," close quote, was political fodder created on the spur of the moment and sent via a political messenger to bolster the administration, and Lincoln used it along with Grant's sketchy reports in talks to various philanthropic and veterans groups. The role of the administration in this campaign is very telling. From Lincoln's touching profession of faith, quote, "I neither know nor care to know the details of what you propose. If there is anything you want, let me know," close quote, to Grant's equally reassuring assumption of responsibility for all actions to follow, and Lincoln's congratulatory letter as Grant announced the crossing of the James, which said, "I see it now, you will succeed, God bless you." Both Grant and Lincoln did what they did best. Lincoln got a general who was going to fight. Lincoln said, "If everyone can't skin, the others can hold a leg." And Grant got the resources without any interference from the administration. Grant's reports to the administration were simple and straightforward. He didn't exactly spill the beans over all the bloodshed. Conversely, he didn't engage in flowery prose or overstatements. If the general strategy didn't exactly unfold as planned, Grant still made the adjustments necessary to assure success. He understood the numbers and the logistics of the war. He had isolated the various components of the Confederacy. He knew where their foodstuffs were coming from, and he sought to snuff them out. He knew he could get replacements while Lee couldn't. His decision to suspend the prisoner cartel was rooted in the knowledge that each exchanged Confederate was a reinforcement to an army that had no other means of growth. Another reason, which is often overlooked, was the status and treatment, the political status and treatment of black Union soldiers who were captured by the Confederacy. The fact that the rebels refused to exchange these soldiers ran afoul of the administration's normalization processing for blacks. These all produced harsh conditions between countrymen, conditions which still rankle nearly 135 years later. In Grant's later years, he admits to regretting the final assault at Cold Harbor in June 1864, in which 7,000 Union soldiers fell in just 20 minutes. It is the only time he ever expressed regret for any military action he ordered. This doesn't mean that he was not compassionate. I think he was. But he certainly didn't visit the hospitals often. It is said he hated the sight of blood. Still, he had the moral fortitude in order to order men to do what needed to be done. As other theaters began to wind down, Grant disposed of political officers who had proven to become military liabilities. Butler, Burnside, Banks, Sigel all disappeared. George Thomas was goaded, cajoled, and threatened with dismissal before he finally discharged the remnants of Hood's army in front of Nashville. Sheridan was given the task of eliminating the Shenandoah Valley as a granary, and he succeeded. In the end, when Richmond fell, Grant was in pursuit of Lee west of Richmond. Grant worked closely with Lincoln to understand his desires for Reconstruction. He deferred all issues of political concern to the government and limited himself to military matters when his subordinate Sherman exceeded his authority and offered inappropriate terms to Johnson, Grant corrected them. He avoided the hoopla of celebration and merely sought to return to his family as soon as practical. Had he not done so, he would have been in Ford's Theater that evening as well. Grant's legacy is considerable. Noteworthy scholars such as Peter Paret, General J.F.C. Fuller, John Keegan, Kenneth Williams, T. Harry Williams have all written at length concerning him. Bill McFeely won a Pulitzer with his Grant biography, and men such as Desert Storm Commander Norman Schwarzkopf have studied him carefully and spoken highly of him. He was progressive in his thinking. This permitted him to understand where the real sources of power were. He knew the war had to be carried to the heart of an enemy's power centers. In the South, that meant the factories and farms of the rebellion. The South had to be totally and utterly defeated before she could be reconstructed. She had to understand that she had erred and there was a price to pay. Grant's willingness to make war on the enemy's war-making capabilities revealed a visionary sense of total war. It is a policy which we implemented to its decisive and bloody conclusion in World War II, when we bombed the cities and ball bearing plants, the petroleum, oil, and lubricant sites, and when faced with potential military invasion which could cost tens of thousands of American lives, we used atomic energy against population centers. In both wars, the enemy was totally and utterly defeated and surrendered unconditionally. Those terms, or lack thereof, destroyed the opposing government and prevented them from resurrecting any semblance of an old order. U.S. Grant was not a great man, or for that matter, a great soldier, but he was a great general. Those who doubt that need merely examine our European cousins' writings about the Civil War to understand. Grant may never be loved, and I suspect he will never be forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind attention. I'm happy to take any questions. What do you want to talk about? Sure.
Very early on, at Fort Henry and Fort Donaldson, unconditional surrender. And then after that, very merciful. What brought about the transition? Or just an apple and oranges kind of scenario?
No, it's not. The political imperatives of the war and Reconstruction have become a significant factor by that point. Once it was clear, and it certainly was clear from the fall of Atlanta, that the war had an inevitable conclusion, Lincoln was able to begin to turn his attentions towards whatever would be the kindest way of reestablishing federal authority within the defeated South. He got together with Sherman and Porter and Grant in a meeting at City Point, in which they spent a day or so talking about the details of what Lincoln intended to do in terms of the Reconstruction. When Lincoln visited Richmond the day after it fell, he spoke with the military governor, or the man who was to be the military governor, and somebody help me out, his name is just slipping off the tip of my tongue. The gentleman that he had selected to become the military governor was talking to Lincoln as they were walking through the streets. And, or no, he was actually sitting on the boat waiting to speak with the Confederate commissioners who were going to meet with him unofficially. And the great fear that the Confederates had was that there would be a very harsh retribution against anybody who held positions of authority within the Confederate government. So consequently, when come back to me in a second. Ord? No, not E.O.C. Ord. I'm starting to see his name. It's not Heinzelman, but it's something rhymes with Wetzel. When the Confederate commissioners expressed concern that there would be too harsh a policy stated, Lincoln said, well, he said, it's not necessarily for me to state since you're under military control. However, I've never felt that this was harsh Reconstruction was necessary, but that's up to General Wetzel, and General Wetzel, of course, being a good, smart soldier, bobbed his head up and down and said, I agree. And as Wetzel and Lincoln were alone, and Wetzel asked him, how should I treat these people in this Confederate capital? Lincoln said, let them down easy, let them down easy. So I think what happened was Lincoln had stated that the only condition that was required for the end of the war was the peaceful acceptance of the primacy of the central federal government and the agreement for the rebel soldiers to lay down their arms and agree not to take up arms again against the federal government. Having achieved that purpose, the effective dismantling of the Army of Northern Virginia, that was sufficient in and of itself to bring upon the end of the war and achieve the purpose that he wanted, the rations, all these other things. In war, Grant would be absolutely ruthless. This is obvious. He understood that foods that were feeding the Army were not being generated 100 yards behind Lee's lines. They were being generated in the granaries of Georgia and in Alabama and so forth. And so he understood that he had to go in there and he had to burn those areas out. He had to destroy the Shenandoah Valley so that a crow flying over there would have to carry his own provender. He knew that that was necessary, and it was harsh, but it was real. And once they broke the spirit in the lines in front of Petersburg, Confederates were trooping over the lines every night by the scores, just turning themselves in. They had enough.
Something I'm hearing, I guess, between the lines is the importance of the stage of the war. For example, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson knew early on a need to be firm and have resolution, but at the end of the war, a need to offer an olive branch.
Well, I think that Grant, and I tried to emphasize this point, I'll restate it for purposes of illustration here. Grant believed the war to be immoral. This was a personal mantra he had. In other words, he didn't believe that the rebels had a legitimate moral cause for creating all this ruckus. So therefore, they were less than honorable foes. And so it was not possible to negotiate with people who did not earn that respect. They were outside the Union. They were rebels. They didn't have any rights to anything. They all should have been hung with ropes. And so Grant's feeling at that point was, no, we may have been classmates, General Buckner, but you're wrong. You're on the wrong side. And I won't treat with rebels. You'll surrender now, and if you don't, I will crush you.
So an evolution of his understanding of the rebellion.
I think, yes, I think that had Lincoln not provided the new strategic objectives of the country, which were the reconstruction of the defeated army, which everybody knew was coming, I believe that had Lincoln not provided any guidance, then the logical conclusion is Grant would have totally shattered Lee's army. There would have been repeat of Sailor Creek everywhere they went. He had infantry in front of Lee at Appomattox, and Lee would have been absolutely demolished. The war was going to end there. The question was, would there be a lot of bodies left? It must become obvious to you over the course of the past few days that your position, and this is a paraphrase of this, that your position is now impossible. I now must shift from myself to you the responsibility for the infusion of further blood in this conflict. Surrender. And Lee tries he's following Davis's imperative. Davis says, we're going to fight it out. So Lee says, well, what would you like to do for peace? Didn't read my lips. We're not talking about peace. We're talking about the surrender of your army. I don't want to kill any more of your men. We're not talking about peace. That's an issue for President Lincoln and the so-called leaders of your rebellion. I'm talking about how I will spare your brave soul if there's any more bloodshed. And that's how he approached it. So he really didn't change his policy in dealing with matters military. He stayed in matters military. When it came to the issue of allowing them to lay down their arms, once Lee had conceded there would be no further fighting, then the guidance he had received from the president kicked in, and that's where he went.
Okay.